Dominated by an increased focus on employee rights and in particular sexual harassment litigation, what can businesses expect as far as legal issues in the workplace are concerned in 2011? Well, Joydeep Hoare is Managing Principal at workplace law firm People and Culture Strategies, and he joins me now with some insights. Joydeep, Happy New Year to you. We have seen a lot of talk around harassment and bullying in the workplace, really out of the David Jones scandal, which came through last year. Do you think workplaces are now more prepared because of the kind of light that's been shone on that issue?
I think they're probably more aware of the risk of it. I think organisations are still coming to grips with what the ramifications of that kind of claim are. I think it was such a headline-grabbing case in terms of the dollar figures that were being claimed, and of course there's a sentiment that 37 million was claimed, 850 was awarded. Was it a good outcome or a bad outcome? I think that kind of misses the point of what really should be the focus of employer attention, which is, are we at risk? And many organisations will still be very much at risk if they don't have a few fundamentals and basics in place. I mean, for example, do they have the right policies and procedures? Have they done the right kind of training, awareness within their organisation? Are they making it a live issue? Are they paying more than lip service to it? And I think one of the real learnings out of that case was, what do you do when a senior person is the subject of the complaint? What are your complaint handling mechanisms? And so I think a lot of organisations still have a bit of work to do to really say that, well, we've covered that risk off.
Do you feel there are any particular areas within what you've just mentioned there that really need to have a particular area of focus for employees? Yeah. Is there any kind of obvious issues not being addressed by most organisations?
I think that the biggest risk areas are, particularly at the moment, something like social networking, which we've spoken about previously, the whole Facebook interaction amongst co-workers, off-site events, a surprising number of harassment claims just in the last couple of weeks that we've had to advise clients on, the December Christmas party type cases, which is almost a cliche in terms of how common it's become, even in spite of a lot of attention to this issue in the last 12 months, still an alarming number of incidents, Christmas parties and things in the last few weeks.
Is that because you think employees are becoming more aware of their own rights as well?
I think there's a perception that a lot of this is triggered by greater employee awareness. I think that's certainly a part of it. But I think people are just becoming a lot more comfortable with co-workers, and when you throw in alcohol and people letting their hair down at the end of the year, it's a bit of a recipe for disaster.
Occupational health and safety, that's another key focus area for 2011 from where you sit too.
Yeah, definitely. What we can expect, particularly with a likely change of government in New South Wales, is a harmonised occupational health and safety scheme around the country, long overdue. What we've had up to now is a situation where each state has had its own OHS regime, and it's applied things slightly differently. The penalties have differed if an organisation's being prosecuted. All of that consolidated into a national OHS scheme will certainly be good for employers in terms of efficiency and administration, but also it will increase some of the severity of the penalties, because if, for example, an employer is prosecuted in New South Wales, the courts will be able to have regard to their track record in other states, which historically has not been the case. So for a lot of the bigger employers around the country, that's going to be a big milestone if it happens.
2010 was really important to see how the Fair Work Australia aspect would play out in terms of workplace relations as well. Where do you see that going in 2011, and what are the issues you're looking to kind of resolve as well?
Yeah, I think organisations really no longer have an excuse to say that we didn't know when it comes to award rates, penalty rates, all of those kinds of things. I think what we will see is Fair Work Ombudsman being very active, because there will be an expectation now that employers have their house in order, they're paying people correctly, employers are complying with their obligations, and it's certainly not going to be enough to keep their head in the sand.
It's still throwing up unexpected decisions, though, in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. As you're always going to get with any new legislation, the Fair Work Act was quite radical. I mean, everyone talks about work choices being very radical, but the Fair Work Act really left very little wriggle room for employers in terms of the safety net, which it said all employers have to afford to employees. So a lot of employers still struggling with that, and really need to make sure that they're auditing what they've got in place, what they're paying people, what they should be paying people, making sure that they're not exposed to prosecution. Because if they are, unfortunately, some significant penalties can be imposed against them, up to $33,000 in respect of each breach. Now, if you're breaching in respect of one employee, that counts as a single breach. You just multiply that by 100 in respect of 100 100 employees, that's a lot of money.
Is that still up for debate, those award? Because we had the change to the 2-hour minimum work and those kind of aspects, which I know people have tried, or some employers have tried to argue against.
Yeah.
But do you expect there to be any changes?
Look, I think there'll always be a little bit of tinkering as the reality of the system and the effects that it's going to have on employers is properly realised. But I think in terms of the guts of the system, it's pretty much settled. So employers do need to understand what's binding on them. And I think an important learning for them is that there's more that is binding on them now than has ever been the case. So the flexibility that employers have, some would say, is far less than has historically been the case as well.
And it looks like we're a couple of days into the new paid parental leave scheme as well, which I would love to ask you about. I know that the Minister for Housing and Families has said that employers can't use this as an excuse to water down their own schemes that they already had in place. What's the legal status there for employers and for employees? Yeah,
so a lot of employers had reasonably generous, in some instances, paid parental leave schemes, and they were trying to come to grips with, well, what do we do? We were already affording 10, 12, 14 weeks pay. Now the government's saying that, you know, there's X number of weeks that we're going to fund. The strict legal position is that employers don't have to honour what was their previous
so they can cut their existing schemes, basically.
Well, it is going to depend very heavily on what were the terms of the contract, were they documented in a policy and things like that. If those things were a matter of contract, then that is going to be binding on the employer. But if it was something that was a bit more discretionary, maybe that's going to give the employer a little bit more latitude. I think what employers have to be very careful about, though, when it comes to something like this, is that employees have an expectation of what they're going to get, and the key issue for them is how they communicate whatever it is that they're going to do directly to their employees, so there's no misunderstanding about that. A lot of employees will see the government scheme as being on top of what their previous employer was going to offer them. So if they're going to take that away, there needs to be some explanation as to why that's going to happen.
Do you expect this is going to be an area of difficulty, one that you will come across with clients coming to you this year?
I think it will, and I think precisely this interplay between, was the employer obliged to honour the old scheme, and is this something that's got to be on top, or is this something that can be in lieu?
Such an emotive issue as well, isn't it? People are going to pursue it with passion, I would imagine.
It's always an interesting one as to, I've found it interesting, people saying that they wouldn't have decided to go down a particular path in their life if they didn't know what a particular payment arrangement was going to be.
Yeah, so it's big. Joydeep, we thank you for your time today. Thanks very much. We look forward to chatting to you through the new year as well.
Likewise.
Joydeep Hoare from People and Culture Strategies with me in studio today. And coming up after this break...